Welcome to the Robert Wenzel Show. Please stand by for Robert Wenzel.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Robert Wenzel Show. I'm Robert Wenzel. I have two guests that will be joining me today, Robert Morrow and Judy Morris. They are going to be discussing with me Israeli attack on the USS Liberty, what might have prompted it, the LBJ role, and what else LBJ might have had in mind. So, Robert and Judy, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let me ask you both about the USS Liberty attack itself. Now, I always got the impression, and this is just from reading casually about it, that it was a mistake. The Israelis misidentified a ship and all that kind of thing. But Judy, from what you wrote, it's clear it could not have been a mistake. I mean, there was surveillance going on. Tell us what happened.
The sanitized version is that it was a mistake, but that was impossible. And most of this information is verified and documented by the survivors. And there are two books out. One was this guy named Ennis, who wrote a book, and he was on the USS Liberty. And in 2003, investigative journalist Peter Hunan went and tracked down a lot of these people and interviewed them, and also relied heavily on Ennis's work. The Israelis started at 6 a.m. doing reconnaissance flight over the USS Liberty. They knew the ship was marked. They said they were flying so low and so close that they were waving at each other. Anyway, at 7 o'clock in the morning, the commander of the USS Liberty just, his flag was a little tattered and worn, so he got the biggest brand new flag he had, and he raised it. Well, these things went on all day long. And that was not unusual because they were 13 miles off the coast of Gaza. And it's important because this thing is played out in the context of the Six-Day War. The USS Liberty attack was actually on the fourth day of the Six-Day War. And the Six-Day War is important because the Israelis really won it on the first hour of the first day when they wiped out the Egyptian Air Force that was on the ground in Cairo. So there is no way this ship could have been mistaken. The official story is it was an Egyptian horse ship, a ship carrying horses. I've seen photos of this Egyptian-style horse ship and the USS Liberty, which is basically a U.S. Navy spy ship. And the Israelis knew what it was. So all this being an accident, it just doesn't pass the sniff test based on the eyewitness account.
Okay, so now we move on. And this wasn't just like one missile shot at the USS Liberty. I mean, it was an ongoing attack for hours. And am I correct about that?
It started at 2 p.m. Israeli time, and it lasted an hour and 15 minutes, according to Ennis. So that was an hour and 15 minutes of sheer hell. Not only that, they were throwing everything at them. They were bombing them from the air. They were using napalm. The decks were just flaming. Then about 30 minutes later, they brought in torpedo boats that were attacking them. They were bombed from the air. The torpedoes were doing all kinds of damage to them. These people thought they were going to die.
Even the life rafts were being machine gunned by the Israeli torpedo boats, which is a war crime. Nobody does that around the world unless they've got a serious war crime going on. But go ahead, Judy. Okay,
well, one of the most amazing things about the whole story is that the first thing they went after was their telecommunication capabilities because, it was like a spy ship that had all these antennas and things all over it. Nobody could miss it. But they went to knock them out, and they did. Everything went dead. But one of these radio men figured out that there was one transformer that wasn't on at the time of the attack, and he literally ventured through the napalm flaming deck and string-wired a communication device, so he actually got the thing working. But then they were depressed it didn't work because the Israelis had high-tech sophisticated jamming. So as they tried to get a signal out, this is 10 minutes after the attack, they found out the signal was jammed. But the most important thing that they discovered, this is why, it's good to have people with brains around you, they discovered that while the Israeli jets were actually dropping bombs on them, that their jamming equipment didn't work. And that's when a signal got out and started bouncing. The first signal was kind of garbled, but they got confirmation. And, well, I don't know a lot about communications, least of all military communications, but when you go through Hunan's book, you find out how these signals work. Like, any signal that came in would automatically go to NSA, to the Pentagon, to the White House. It hit all the ships in the area. There is confirmation that 2 U.S. embassies actually got the signal. And what the jamming device did, they neutered the Mayday international distress signal. I mean,
let's pause on that for a second. They were jamming the Liberty's communications on the frequency, the 5 frequencies they were using. They jammed the international Mayday frequency. That is a huge red flag. But go ahead, Judy.
Yeah, I mean, nobody does that. Apparently, even in war. And, you know, I don't know much about what happens in war. But anyway, the USS Liberty people figured out they had a few seconds of opportunity. And it was like a freak accident. They had one transformer that they could string wire, and they were smart enough to figure out that they could get a signal through when they were actually being bombed. And this signal actually went through 10 minutes after the attack and bounced everywhere. Probably the Israelis picked it up, all the U.S. ships picked it up. D.C., I'm sure, got it. Most of those people probably knew instantaneously that the ship was under attack.
The SOS were called flash bulletins, the highest priority alert you can send out.
Okay, so let me make clear. There was jamming going on, but as the Israelis were actually dropping the bombs, there would be a break in the jamming.
For whatever reason, at that time, the jamming devices that they had did not work when they were actually dropping bombs. And the Liberty crew, somebody picked up on this, and they only had like 5 seconds of opportunity in between, all the bombs, because the Israelis would come, drop the bombs, and, the planes would pass, come back around again. They were using these, precious seconds of opportunity to get a distress signal out. And that's critically important because, as we get into the whole story and we look back at this horror, after I finished Hunan's book, the first thing that entered my mind was, my God, what if that signal never got out? What would have happened?
They would have slit their throats in silence and nobody would have known about it. That's what would have happened.
Yeah. Now, how many servicemen on the U.S. Liberty actually died?
34 out of a crew of 296. But there were major, major injuries, too. I mean, people lost their legs. They were, I think there was something like 171 injuries. I mean, most of those people were, carted off to the hospital. And I don't know how many of them were sailors, because the Liberty crew was a spy ship, and they had people from NSA, they had independent contractors, and they all hung out in this crazy secret room that had high-level security.
Here's an interesting ratio for you. There were 34 people murdered on the USS Liberty. There were 171 injured out of 294 people approximately. That's a 70% casualty rate. The Israelis weren't just trying to sink an American ship. They're trying to kill every single human being on it, including machine gunning life rafts.
Yeah, and the Liberty was defenseless. It had 4 50 caliber machine guns, which made it useless against, bombs and the motorized torpedo boats that were hurling stuff at them. I mean, it was like a water pistol compared to what was coming at them. And it was well known that USS Liberty had zero defense capabilities. It was a sitting duck, totally defenseless.
Well, now, because there were survivors, though, that's how we know a lot about the extent of the attack, how it occurred, and so on. Is that correct?
That's correct. And at first, you have to understand, this is 1967. People believed in the U.S. government, and these people could not believe that the government would do this to them. It took many of them many, many years and decades to finally accept the truth, because it was just very painful for them to accept that the government that they swore an oath to serve was so monstrously evil to want to send them to their death. They thought about it.
Right. Now, as far as the Mayday signal, the SOS signal that went out, some U.S. naval ships actually received that and started responding. Is that correct?
Yeah. There was one ship that was closest by where the commander actually ordered a rescue mission. They could be there in 10 or 15 minutes. The Liberty crew was expected to be rescued within, 15, 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes at the most. Help was on the way. So they were relieved. Well, what happened was that help never came, and it's well documented that McNamara had a conversation with the commander who said, call it off. Not only was it called off once, after it was called off, the commander ordered another rescue. McNamara got on the phone again, and LBJ got on the phone and said, call off the rescue. I will not embarrass an ally.
Another way of what LBJ said, which has not been confirmed, but it sounds like LBJ, was that he said, and I haven't confirmed this, I want that damn ship sunk. Call off the wings. That means the airplanes. Call off the wings. And let's be specific here. It wasn't the commander in the Mediterranean that was calling these things back. He got a direct order from Robert McNamara to call back the rescue planes that were flying to the Liberty to protect it from the Israeli attack. And then he said that the commander, asked McNamara, says, I want to speak to your commander. And that's when Lyndon Johnson got on the radio and said either I will not embarrass an ally or sink that damn ship. Take your pick.
Now, where are we getting this report from as far as the LBJ quotes?
The one that's in Hunan's book is, and it's on the back cover, we will not embarrass an ally. That's the only thing he records as far as LBJ joining in with the conversation with McNamara as the Admiral was trying to, get another rescue crew off.
Getting it from Admiral Martin or Admiral Geis, who told it to one of the survivors of the USS Liberty.
Okay. All right. Good. All right. Now, let's move on a little bit beyond the attack itself. And Judy, you've done some research and uncovered other information that besides the attack, there was something going on with nuclear attack planes. Fill us in on that. What was going on at that same time?
Well, what was amazing is that there was this guy, he was in California.
Jim Nanjo.
And he got called out of bed California time. He wasn't sure. He claims it was between 1 and 4. And it was the highest alert, an alert that he said he never saw. He was 20 years in the hydrogen bomb department. So he basically just, flew these nuclear-armed planes. So he jumps out of bed and runs to the runway. And he's stuck there revving, but they had no orders. Things are mysterious in the military. You just wait for your orders. And sat there probably for hours. He didn't know what was going on. He had no idea the Liberty had even been attacked. Eventually, they called it off, and he went back, turned on TV, turned on the news or the radio or something, and he heard what happened. Well, the whole story just gnawed at him because eventually he learned from talking to other pilots, how they talk to each other, that there were similar alerts going out in other parts of America, in Spain, and elsewhere in the world. I mean, this was the huge major alert. And one of the words that he used in his interview with Peter Hunan was, he was terrified. This was Armageddon, the end of the world. I mean, he thought that he was going to go on a mission to nuke somebody, and he did confirm at first when he interviewed Hunan, he didn't want to talk about what he was carrying, and he eventually said weapons of mass destruction, and then he eventually confirmed that they were thermonuclear weapons. And Nanjo was just puzzled because his mind started thinking, wait a minute, how could this attack occurred? How could I be on alert before the attack occurred? And that's when all these times come into play. It's 2 o'clock Israeli time, which is 7 a.m. D.C. time, which is 4
o'clock California time. And he says the Strategic Air Wing was alerted at very early in the a.m. on June the 8th. Now, was it alerted before the Liberty was attacked or after? It seems to kind of appear that it was alerted before the USS Liberty was attacked, which would imply knowledge by the U.S. government that this was going to happen, which would imply participation of the U.S. government.
And there were other things that kind of document that this was a planned event. Even the Six-Day War was a planned event. LBJ was hurting in the polls. There was a possibility he was going to lose in a general election and maybe even lose the Democratic nomination. He was in a tizzy. And he wanted what he called a Tonkin resolution, a false flag attack, give him the power. And he had actually called in a lower-level Israeli ambassador, and he had a discussion with this guy. For some reason, LBJ did not bring in the main ambassador, but what was amazing was this conversation that he had with him. He basically said, you and I are going to get our Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And the ambassador was kind of confused, didn't even know why he'd been called in because it was unusual for a president to call in a low-ranking ambassador anyway.
It was a low-ranking Israeli ambassador. We should point that out.
Yeah. And let me find LBJ's quote. It was actually kind of humorous. This is what he said. He told this ambassador, I, Lyndon Johnson, have to get congressional approval if I want to act as president of the United States. Otherwise, I'm just a 6'4" Texas friend of Israel. I mean, those are the words that the guy later wrote that he said. And he also said, that description stuck in my memory. But then he said, but you and I are the most powerful people in Washington. We are going to get Congress to pass another Tonkin resolution. So the Israeli ambassador, lower-level ambassador, interpreted that to mean that Johnson was really furious because he couldn't do what he wanted, and he had to go. For him, it was humiliating to go to Congress to get a resolution to go to war. And that was very, very significant. And this was back in May. This was, before the Six-Day War. So there's a lot of documentation that the Six-Day War was on the drawing board, and it had been ordered by the U.S. because anybody who knows anything about Israel, they understand it is the 51st state. And Israel was pretty much just as corrupt as, America, and the military-industrial complex pretty much runs the foreign policy of both nations.
Hey, Judy, talk about how the U.S. and Britain was secretly helping Israel in the Six-Day War as far as intelligence and jamming radio frequencies and so forth that appears in the book Operation Sinai.
Well, even a year before, there was this guy, Sorrells. He was a technician, and the CIA and the military hired a lot of, independent contractor technicians. And he had been on the ground a year before, installing all this high-tech spy equipment. He was well connected because he personally knew the head of the Israeli Mossad. And he really didn't know the missions. He was just, doing this and that and paid a lot of money to do it. But he did meet with Hunan, and he told Hunan, he said, Sorrells describes the commonly held notion that Israel fought this war on its own. Anybody working around intelligence knows this isn't true. And so he was absolutely convinced that Israel takes its orders from the U.S. and that he was there with hundreds of other contractors for a year, maybe 2 years, on a U.S. mission.
Here's the key point. A lot of times you'll hear that Israel was attacking the USS Liberty, and they were going to blame it on Egypt because they wanted America to come into the war, the Six-Day War, on their side. And the key point is that the America and Britain were already coordinating completely with Israel during the Six-Day War, while their public stance was a false one of neutrality.
Okay. All right. Now, Judy and Robert, we've pretty much got the facts here. I mean, the Liberty was attacked fiercely. It appears that the intention was to sink that ship, to possibly kill everybody on board.
Hey, Bob, it wasn't to possibly kill everybody on board. It was to kill and murder everybody on board and completely wipe out any potential survivors and witnesses.
Okay. So we also have nuclear missiles in various sites, the ones on different planes on alert. And now the thought is that this was to be a possible attack on Egypt. How do you make the jump from pilots on alert in their nuclear planes to an attack on Egypt?
Yeah, there was this survivor. His name was Mo Schaefer, and he ended up on he was injured. He ended up on the USS Davis, which was the flagship of the Sixth Fleet. Well, the guy's name was Martin, Admiral Martin. Well, this guy was sitting, having his wounds tended to, and Admiral Martin came in and paid him a personal visit. And he basically told him, and this is basically how Hunan writes it up. He said, he's quoting this Joe Schaefer, not only did Admiral Martin tell me that 4 jets were on their way to the Liberty with conventional weapons and were recalled. That we know about the recall. He also stated that 4 were on their way to Cairo, loaded with nuclear weapons. He stated that they were 3 minutes from bombing them. That's the Egyptians. He also stated that the jets could not land back on the carriers, and they landed in Athens because back then, I don't know what they do now. If a nuclear-armed plane takes off, it's got a nuclear device, it cannot land back on the carrier. It's got to land on land. It's just too dangerous.
It's too risky to re-land back on a carrier. You have to land somewhere.
They will land a plane with a non-nuclear device, an ordinary bomb. But anything with a nuclear device had to land in Athens back then.
What is the theory on why they were called off at the last minute?
Russians got on the hotline and said, what are you doing? You're sending airplanes to Cairo. Do you really want an expanded war in the Middle East? We'll turn Israel into a grease spot. We know what you're up to, America. We're watching you.
At that point, the lines were burning between D.C. because the Russians had all these trawlers disguised. They had these spy ships disguised as trawlers, and apparently we figured out what they were, but they were hard to find. The Russians were there. They knew what was going on.
Judy, you're saying the trawlers were viewing the attack on the USS Liberty.
We don't know. They may have. All we know is they at least picked up the signal that bounced after the first 10 minutes at 2:10. So it's entirely possible. It would be impossible for the Russians not to pick it up because they were right there. This was in the middle of the 6-day war, even though it was mostly over. So the phones started burning between D.C. and Moscow. And my guess and Robert's guess are pretty much the same. They're picking up the phone, calling LBJ, saying, "Oh my God, you moron, we're onto you. We know what you just did. We're going to expose your crimes to the world unless you call this thing off, But exactly. Look at it this way. Only the President of the United States has the authority to give the order to use nuclear bombs. And
Correct.
Only the President has the authority to recall those bombs if they're in the air or on the sea or wherever they're going to be launched. So LBJ had to have given the order to load up all these planes with nuclear devices, at least in California that we know, and at least according to Admiral Martin, there were 4 of them in the air within 3 minutes of Cairo in the Mediterranean.
That's pretty astounding, is what Admiral Martin said. He says these nuclear-loaded American airplanes that took off from our aircraft carriers were 3 minutes away from Cairo when they got called off.
Wow.
That's bone
That's what he said.
Wow.
That's what he said. And that's how close we came to nuclear war in the Middle East and maybe in America at that time. Go ahead, Judy.
Now, this is where the story gets really speculative because, Robert and I have had this discussion. When did LBJ realize that his whole plan blew up, that the USS Liberty managed to get out a signal that bounced all over the place, all over the world pretty much, effectively? And what was he going to do about all these airplanes that were loaded with nuclear bombs? He had to give the order to call it off. I mean, exactly how this all came down, I don't know. He knew that his attack was a failure. Then there were also stories, and Robert knows about this, if you get into it, about some of the Israeli pilots were actually dropping their bombs into the Mediterranean Sea and just refusing to strike the Liberty because they had the firepower to probably knock it out 10 or 15 minutes. But they
could have sank that ship right off the bat, but what it was the Israeli pilots who were in the air. They're not stupid. They're the best trained pilots that Israel has. And they were radioing back, "This is an American ship. Do you still want us to attack?" And they would keep radioing back, and they'd say, "Yes, attack." "Are you sure it's an American ship? Do you want us to attack?" "Yes, attack." And there's a guy named Barry Chamish, if I pronounce his name right. He interviewed one of the pilots, and he says, "You know what, Barry? At one point I was dumping my ordnance into the water." That's what one pilot said. Another pilot was refusing orders to attack the Liberty, and he was arrested when he landed his plane back in Tel Aviv. So they were having like a little rebellion going on amongst the pilots themselves because they couldn't understand these orders to attack an American ship, and some of them were refusing to do it. The first pilots, their goal was to knock out the communication of the Liberty. That was the most important thing, not to sink the ship. They were going to knock out the communication of the Liberty, jam their signals, and let the torpedo boats sink it. That was the game plan.
So in other words, what you're really saying is because the Liberty was able to send out that SOS signal, which the Russians picked up, that's really what stopped the nuclear attack on Cairo.
Because it's the only way it could have played out. Had that signal not gone out, the whole world could have been exploded into a nuclear holocaust. LBJ had given the order to do it. And Even the Israelis, I think, weren't that crazy when you look at the takeaways from the thing. I mean, yeah, they were obsessed with expanding their real estate. They always are. But they were terrified of the Russians. I mean, because they figured that if there's an all-out war, they're going to be the first people that get wiped out.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. If Russia had entered the Six-Day War, little bitty old Israel would have been shot to pieces. I don't care if the American Sixth Fleet is out there. There would have been a battleground in Israel, destroying much of it. And so the key point that Judy and I are making is this, is that many people know that Israel intentionally attacked an American ship. Okay, many people know that, right? But what we're trying to say is that they were doing something against their national interest by doing that. And the only reason they were attacking the USS Liberty was upon the direct orders of the head of the American state, Lyndon Johnson.
If the nuclear bombs would have actually dropped on Cairo, what would have been LBJ's justification? When he gets on TV to talk to the American people, what would he say?
He would say this. He'd say, "My fellow Americans, we have had tragedy in the Mediterranean. The Egyptians have sunk an American ship and killed all 294 people on it. As your president, and in defense of the United States of America, I have ordered an attack on Cairo." That's what he would have said.
You're right, Robert.
It would have sounded just like that, too.
We have to understand this is a wag the dog moment. We got a president that's doing this only because he's thinking in the polls.
Robert, talk about LBJ now. I mean, you sent me some material about him and how insane this guy was.
Right. Okay, here's a point that's key to understand, because when you tell people about the USS Liberty, many people will say, okay, we understand Israel understood it was an American ship and they attacked it. All right, we understand that. It was a mistake, but it could not have been. Why would they do it? And then we say, well, Lyndon Johnson ordered them to do this. So you mean that Lyndon Johnson was that crazy? Yes. Lyndon Johnson was a lunatic. And many people around him have commented on his mental instabilities, people who were very close to him. George Reedy, one of his aides for 15 years, wrote a book called Lyndon B. Johnson, a memoir. You go to Amazon.com and buy that book, and you hear all these outrageous stories, one after another, about his paranoia, his mental instabilities. I'm not saying he was a full-blown alcoholic, but he was halfway an alcoholic. McGeorge Bundy, his former national security advisor, has talked about his mental instabilities. Bill Moyers said he was sick. Richard Goodwin, who married Doris Kearns Goodwin, worked for both Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. He wrote a chapter about LBJ's mental instabilities in his book, and it's called Descent. The chapter is called The Descends into Craziness. When Bill Moyers and Richard Goodwin worked for Lyndon Johnson as the weight of the Vietnam War was cracking the man mentally and, of course, covering up the JFK assassination, which he was involved in, they went to psychiatrists, and they described Lyndon Johnson's symptoms, his paranoia, he thinks the New York Times has been taken over by communists, of course they're socialists, but, he thinks that there are communists everywhere, and he's irrational, saying weird things. And what the psychiatrists diagnosed off the back of an envelope, without examining LBJ personally, of course, was that you have a paranoid in disintegration. Not just a paranoid God, but a paranoid God that has finally cracked and gone nuts. So LBJ definitely had the mental instability and the depravity to do something this lunatic, because only a lunatic would have ordered Israel to do that.
Well, only a lunatic also would have ordered that all these planes take off from all these air bases, throughout the Mediterranean and Europe and the U.S. loaded with nuclear bombs. I don't even know where all these planes and bombs were going. We do know, based on Admiral Martin, that he knew of 4, and they ended up landing in Athens. So it is kind of interesting. And Mr. Wansel, I just want to tell you one more thing. In the book, Operation Cyanide by Peter Hoonan, he does talk about this guy who was there. The guy's name is Philip Torney. My blog post actually ended up at spreadlibertynews.com, and forget about all the discussion that happened. This guy, Phil Torney, by accident found it, and he commented on the website. Now, this is the highest honor anybody could possibly get for a story. He said, "Dear Judy, how did I get in your world? A world of truth and beauty. Honesty, the real deal. No lies, just the facts. Perfect. God bless you. I can't say any more than you already have. God bless you again, sincerely, Philip F. Torney, USS Liberty survivor. And he actually wrote a book titled What I Saw That Day. So I was kind of happy about that because he pretty much validated what I said, and I basically consolidated a 300-page book into something that ended up a 12-page Word doc, which became the blog post.
Right.
So, there's the USS Liberty groups. I mean, these people are meeting, they're talking, and a lot of them were silent for years and years and even decades, and they want the truth. They've gone to Congress. They can't get anything. It's still a cover-up. And the most amazing thing is that, well, when you think of Bill Clinton or the Clinton crime family or the Bush crime family, a ton of stuff has been written. There's blogs. There's a gazillion books. LBJ gets a pass in history. I've never seen anything like it. He hasn't been exposed for his crimes at all, and he's still a liberal icon who is revered. He's revered. He killed millions of people in Southeast Asia. He's the reason we got over 58,000 names on the Vietnam War Memorial. He came into 3 minutes of bombing Cairo and starting a nuclear war. And
murdered John Kennedy with the CIA's help.
Murdered JFK. I mean, I cannot believe that LBJ has gotten off the hook of the test of history and the truth. It just blows my mind. He may be the most evil president in U.S. history.
Any theories on why, outside of the fact that the media just tends to protect the establishment?
You mean theories on why there's a cover-up?
Why LBJ is getting a pass and no one's discussing it?
Here's the reason why, Bob, and it relates to a lot of things. It relates to the JFK assassination, which, of course, was a coup d'etat. It relates to the attack on the USS Liberty, which was a lunatic war crime committed by the head of the American state and by an inner circle in the Israeli Defense Forces. It relates to CIA drug smuggling. All those things you don't hear spoken about in the mainstream media because the truth, Bob, is so discrediting to the government and to the elites and to the media. It's so discrediting to both the highest levels of the Republican Party, the highest levels of the Democratic Party, the New York Times, the Washington Post, ABC, NBC, CBS. It's discrediting to the academics at our major universities that, for the most part, rarely even talk about this. So that's why it's just not a pleasant topic. That's why they don't want to talk about it.
Look at the USS Liberty and compare it with the Cuban Missile Crisis. A nuclear war was close, but I don't even think the Cuban Missile Crisis came within 3 minutes of dropping a nuclear bomb on a major city that had millions of people.
Here's a key point. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the so-called hotline, which I think really is more of a teletype line than an actual telephone, as far as I know, was put in between, the highest, from the headquarters of the Kremlin to the headquarters of the White House or the Oval Office. And for years, they would only check it like on New Year's Day and say Happy New Year's and stuff like that. The first time the hotline between the Russia and the USA was ever used was during the Six-Day War. That's how dicey things got, and it was used a lot. And on the day of the June 8th, it was used multiple times.
Okay, now, how do we know that?
Well, that has been historically documented. You can pull up Lyndon Johnson's daily schedule, which you can't really trust the whole thing because they're going to leave certain things out. But there are 4 or 5 hotline calls that day.
Okay, all right. So anything included, we know likely occurred. We just don't know what else might have occurred.
Well, yeah. I mean, who didn't went to the LBJ library in Texas and he pulled up the schedule? Actually, it's kind of interesting. LBJ was the guy who was up like at 4 or 5 and was at the Situation Room. Usually presidents only go to the Situation Room during a crisis, but he was there like at 6 o'clock every morning. On the morning of June 8th, LBJ stayed in bed. He had breakfast in bed. He was in his PJs. He never went to work.
I think that his schedule was fabricated for that day, and here's why. If you go to the LBJ library, you can find Lyndon Johnson's daily diary for June 8, 1968. And we know the Liberty was attacked at about 7 o'clock Eastern time. Is that correct, Judy? 7 o'clock Eastern time?
7 o'clock, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which is 2 o'clock Israeli time, right? And we know that the Liberty got off its emergency flash bulletins very quickly. I mean, within 10 minutes or 15. So it had to have gotten to the Pentagon within... Judy, tell me, what time if you had to guess, what time do you think that flash bulletin actually got into the Pentagon headquarters that there was an American ship under attack in the Mediterranean?
somewhere between 7:10 and 7:15. I would say that they knew no later than 7:15 because there's confirmation from other ships that they got it right away.
Okay. Here's the point being. If you look at LBJ's schedule for that day, and you see all the other phone calls that are on, every time he got a phone call, they would log that, right? There are no phone calls in to Lyndon Johnson on his daily schedule until, 8:13 in the morning Eastern Time by Robert McNamara, over an hour and 15 minutes since the bombing of the Liberty began, probably over an hour since the Pentagon found out that an American ship was being attacked. That's just not rational or logical. The head of the American state is going to be told immediately when an American ship comes under attack. If an embassy is attacked around the world, Barack Obama is going to hear about it in 5 minutes, okay? Well, back in the 60s, maybe we would have taken 10 minutes, okay? There is no incoming calls on LBJ's schedule on June 8th until McNamara calls at 8:13. I have a really hard time believing that. I really do.
And he was staying in his bedroom in his apartment. He was like hiding from everybody, according to what Boonan verified. So there's a lot of conflict on his schedule that day. And he claimed to know about it, 8:48, Robert?
I don't know what time LBJ likes to pretend that he found out about the attack on the U.S. Liberty, but he's lying. But go ahead, Judy.
There's also McNamara's role in this whole thing because over the years after he ended up being fired by LBJ, but whenever he was asked about the USS Liberty, he said nothing. He lied through his teeth the whole time. And he was one of the key players in trying to start this war and, murder nearly 300 Americans.
Here's what McNamara told author Peter Hoonan when he asked him about the USS Liberty. He says, the USS Liberty, well, I used to know about that at that time, but I don't now. I forgot all about it.
Yeah, how could you not know about it? It was probably the biggest crisis of his entire career.
It's a massive crisis. It's a crisis on the order of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and McNamara is telling this guy, at the time I knew about that, but I don't know about it now.
He lied about it throughout the rest of his life. He took what he knew to his grave, that's for sure.
This is Arthur Schlesinger talking to Mac Bundy in 1971. The previous quote came from 1969. This comes from 1971. He writes in his diary. He's not telling the New York Times this in real time. We're finding out this 30, 40 years later when his diary is published. He says, I sat next to Mac Bundy, and we had discussed, among other things, the Khrushchev memoirs. I remarked on the curious resemblance between Khrushchev's account of the life around Stalin, the domineering and obsessive dictator, the total boredom of the social occasions revolving around him, the horror when invited to attend, and the even greater horror when not invited, and Albert Speer's account of the life around Hitler. And then Max said, quote, when I read Khrushchev, I was reminded of something else in addition, my last days in the White House with LBJ. Okay, so that's the former National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, comparing Lyndon Johnson to Joseph Stalin.
This is really one of the greatest stories never told.
Well, actually, it's been told, but it's never been told on the center stage of a New York Times article or an op-ed or on a major TV show. But it's been told in books, it's been told on the Internet. It's kind of percolating under the cover. But yes, Bob, that is a hope that people who were involved in that time, who were maybe B-52 pilots at that time, who were involved in the military, who were involved in Israel or American relations or even Egyptian relations, that they'll come forward and add more details to the story and fill in the pieces of the puzzle. Even 45 years later, the truth is important. Even 1,000 years later, the truth is important. So you said, well, who alive today, knows some stuff? Well, the father of John McCain was an admiral named Jack McCain, and he was in the Mediterranean. And he is the one, I'm talking about the dad of John McCain, not John McCain personally, his father. His father was the one that issued a whitewashed cover-up of the USS Liberty within 10 days, very similar to the way that J. Edgar Hoover covered up the JFK assassination. So this whole thing is a very sore point with Senator John McCain of Arizona because his father was one of the ones who covered up this crime. And so John McCain has been very hostile towards the survivors of the USS Liberty. Remember, he's a very important player in the Senate. Do you understand that? He's been there for many, many years on the Senate Armed Services Committee. So he's not a friend to truth on this matter. And he was the Republican nominee for president in 2008. So that's one little nugget I wanted to add right there. So you keep adding people, I wonder, why does the cover-up continue? Well, because, family members of people involved in the cover-up are in very high places, because this story discredits the military, it discredits the presidency, it discredits the media.
Plus the Navy and the CIA and the NSA.
Yeah. So even if certain folks today were not personally involved in that, their institutions were. So they have institutional reasons for covering it up.
Phil Nelson is writing a book on a follow-up on LBJ, and he's going to make the USS Liberty the centerpiece of this book.
Oh, great. That's great news.
So I'm definitely going to be getting that book by Philip Nelson, no question about that.
Absolutely. Judy, Robert, I want to thank you. This is very informative, very eye-opening, and I hope that somehow this reaches other people that may have been involved in that period when the USS Liberty was attacked with planes on a mission headed to Cairo. There has to be people still around that haven't talked, and maybe what you're doing by getting exposure to this story is giving some of those people the courage to come forward so we can understand more of the history of what really went on at that time and what kind of guy LBJ was. Thank you again, Robert. Thank you again, Judy.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Both of you doing more research because you do good stuff. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Great
Bye-bye.
show. Thank you for listening to the Robert Wenzel Show. This is Robert Wenzel. Be sure to check out my website, economicpolicyjournal.com, where I blog 7 days a week about economics, finance, politics, and liberty. Executive producer of the Robert Wenzel Show is Chris Rossini. Head of editing and mastering is John Daubert.